The creek below the Calhoun Creamery ran white twice a day. By that summer, every gallon of it was against the law. Nell Braddock stood on the bank the morning the state man came. She was close enough to smell the sour of it. She watched him nail a paper to the creamery door. 9,000 gallons a week. That was the figure the fine put in writing. It was the figure that would change her life, though nobody in that yard would have believed it of her. Nell was 34 that year. She farmed 60 acres of bottom ground that could never decide what it wanted to be. The low places ran too wet to carry a plow. The high places were too small and stony to graze anything that paid. She kept 30 hogs on it, and she fed them bought corn. That year, bought corn cost $2.40 a bushel. So every pound she put on a hog, she put on at a loss, near enough 4 cents a pound. She had done the arithmetic so many times it had stopped frightening her. It had begun instead to feel like weather, a thing that simply happened to her and could not be argued with. The home place had shrunk to almost nothing under her. She had sold the far pieces one at a time to cover feed bills. Only the last 40 acres were left now, and there was a note on that. $412 due the first week of March. It was not a large sum to a bank. It was the whole world to Nell. Past it, there was nothing else to sell and nowhere else to go. Vernon Calhoun owned the creamery and half the county's good opinion besides. He had an offer standing on that 40, and he did not trouble to hide it. He told the men at the diner that milk slop would never fatten a hog. The widow Braddock would drown her 30 head in it before the leaves turned, and he would take her wet ground off her hands kindly when she did. The men laughed, as men will at a person who is not in the room. Nell was not in the room. She was 2 miles downhill, standing at her own fence, working a sum nobody else had thought to try. The creamery had a problem, and the problem was Whey. For years the creamery had run its way straight into Miller's Creek. Every cheese house in the country had always done the same. The Calhoun place churned butter for its name, but it pressed cheese for its money. And cheese is what makes Whey. When the curd is drawn together and pressed into cheese, the thin liquid that drains away is Whey. It comes off green and faintly sweet. It turns sour within a day, and there is a great deal of it. The creamery kept the curd and sold it. Most of what drained off the vats ran to waste. So the creek below the outfall ran white. The fish went belly up in the shallows. That spring, the state finally counted the dead fish and wrote the fine. Overnight, the Whey stopped being a nuisance and became a liability. The creamery could no longer pour it in the creek. It could not sell it. Now it had to pay to move it. Calhoun called every hauler in 3 counties. Not one of them would take the work at a price he could stand. The reason was simple, and it turned out to be the whole hinge of the thing. Whey is 93% water. The protein carried in it is real, and it is good, but it is thin, and water is heavy. A hauler charges by the mile and by the ton. So a man who hauls Whey is paying to move 7 parts plain water for every 1 part worth a cent. The freight costs more than the Whey is worth before the truck leaves the yard. That is why no cheese house ever shipped its Whey anywhere. It was cheap to make and ruinous to move. So for 100 years it went into the nearest creek, and nobody thought twice. Lem Purdy ran the creamery's cream route. He was the one hauler who did the sum out loud in Calhoun's office. He figured what it would cost to cart 9,000 gallons of water a week to anywhere that would have it. Then he set his pencil down and said there was no doing it. It would go in a pit, or it would go in the creek. Those were the only two roads open. Calhoun had no pit large enough, and the creek was closed to him now. The fine ran on against him every day. The Whey had nowhere to go. That was how things stood the week Nell Braddock knocked on his office door. She carried a contract she had written out by hand at her own kitchen table. She understood none of the chemistry when she signed. What she understood was the shape of the land. Her 60 acres lay 2 miles down the valley from the Creamery. Every foot of those 2 miles fell downhill. She had walked it as a girl, chasing a dog through the bottoms, and she remembered how water always ran the same way through that ground, patient and certain. Water that left the Creamery gate could reach her hog lot without a pump, without a hauler, without a single cent of freight. All it took was a line to carry it and let the fall of the land do the work. So she offered to haul away every gallon of Whey the Creamery made for nothing. She would lift the fine off Calhoun's books in the bargain. He read her paper twice. Then he laughed at her in front of Purdy and 2 of his own men. He asked whether she truly meant to take all his slop off him for free. She told him every gallon. She told him it would cost him nothing, and that she failed to see the joke. He signed. A man who is being fined does not turn down free, even when free arrives wearing an olive chore coat and a woman's name. He signed, and he told Purdy on his way out that he had just watched a woman argue herself into ruin and call it a bargain. That was the first thing the county laughed at. It would not be the last. She spent nearly her last money that week, and she spent it on junk. Off the Creamery's own deadline, she bought a 400-gallon galvanized milk tank. It leaked at a bottom seam. She paid $31 for it because it was scrap and no good to any man with sense. She paid $9 more for a worn truck axle. Out of the axle she built a low cart to carry the tank. Now she had a tank, a cart, and a signed contract for a liquid she had never once fed to an animal. She could not store it for a day. She had no earthly way to sell it. And she had bound herself to all of it before a single hog had tasted a drop. The leak, as it turned out, was the luckiest thing she owned. A tank that would not hold water overnight could not be used to store anything, so she never tried. Instead, she laid a pipe from the Creamery gate straight down the pitch of the valley. The pipe was old milk line, pulled cheap off the Creamery's own dead stock and joined by hand. Joint by joint, 3 long days in the ditch with a borrowed spade until the skin of her hands cracked and bled into her gloves. She ran the line to a long wooden trough beside the hog lot. Then she opened the valve at the top and walked down beside the first rush of it. She watched gravity do the hauling that would have broken any man who paid a wage for it. The tank became nothing more than the thing she filled the trough from. The whole ugly arithmetic of the county's oldest waste turned on one fact. Nell Braddock lived downhill, and her tank was too poor to hold water. She fed it as a hungry person feeds. She gave the hogs all the Whey they would drink, and she cut their corn back to almost nothing. Corn cost hard money. Whey cost her nothing at all. It seemed like the plainest sense in the world. For a week, the hogs drank as though the trough were a miracle sprung out of the ground. Then they began to scour. It came on slowly, and then all at once. The pens went loose and green and sour-smelling under the morning frost. The hogs went off their feed. They stood humped in the corners of the lot with their backs to the wind. 2 of the smallest went down in the straw and did not rise as she needed them to. She had bet the whole farm on this thing. Inside a fortnight, The farm itself was telling her, plainly, that she had bet it wrong. The men at Dwyer's feed store had a name for her by then, the slop woman. They said it as men say a thing they have already decided is settled. Purdy took to stopping at the store to ask, loud enough for the whole floor to hear, whether the slop woman had drowned her hogs yet. He wondered aloud whether Calhoun ought to measure the wet 40 for a corn crib before the frost set hard. It was not clever talk. It did not need to be. It only needed to be said in front of enough people, and it was. She could have quit then, and the quitting would have looked like sense. Instead, she did a harder thing. She went home and she lit the lamp against the early dark. She took her father's ledgers down off the kitchen shelf where they had sat gathering dust since the funeral. Her father had farmed the same wet 60 until the year he died. He had written down every last thing in a small, crabbed hand. Feed and weather and prices and the weight of every hog that ever left the place in columns ruled with a straightedge. Nell had kept the books because she could not bring herself to burn them, not because she thought they held anything she would need. Now she went back through the years, page by patient page, with the lamp pulled close and her finger moving down the columns. In the book kept for 1931, she found an entry that stopped her hand flat against the table. That year her father had bought skim milk from a cheese house over in Danby. Cheap, he fed it to his hogs all through the fall and into the winter. And beside those milk entries, in the same column and the same cramped hand, the hogs he sold that season had graded top of the market. She read the line 3 times to be sure of it. Skim milk and a top grade in the same year in her father's own ink. Then the entries simply stopped. The following spring the cheese house in Danby had closed its doors. The cheap skim stopped with it. And in all the years since, no one in the family had thought to wonder why the top grade had ended the very season the milk ran out. But there was one more thing written on that page, and it proved to be the thing that saved her. Her father had not fed the skim alone. Every milk entry had ground corn set down beside it, in a careful ratio he had worked out for himself. A little less corn as the milk came heavier through the season. He had fed the milk and the corn together, always as 2 halves of one ration. He had never once fed the milk by itself as the whole of it. He had fed it as a part, and the part had made him money. That was the knowledge she had been missing. It had been sitting on her own kitchen shelf the entire time. Whey and skim are not a feed. They are a supplement, and the difference is the whole of the trade. The protein in them is good protein, but it is thin and it is wet. A hog that feels its belly on whey alone fills up on water. It does that long before it takes in enough solid to grow a frame on. Worse, a young pig's gut cannot handle a sudden flood of milk sugar it has never met. So it scours, exactly as hers had scoured in the frost. And the scour was never the whey's fault. It was the ration's fault, which was to say, it was her fault. She had not poisoned her hogs. She had drowned their corn, and she had done it on purpose, believing all the while that she was being thrifty and wise. She understood then that the failure dated to her hand and not to the whey. And that was the first thing that had felt like solid ground beneath her in a month of standing on sand. A fault a person has made is a fault a person can unmake. A verdict is a thing you can only bow your head and accept. She had a fault. Sitting alone at that table, she was almost glad of it. Fixing the thing in private would have been the easy road, and she thought about it. She could have quietly built the corn back into the ration. She could have said not one word to a living soul and let the hogs mend where nobody was watching. But the feed store men had priced her as a fool, and that price was doing its own quiet work against her. The butcher would not book her hogs. Buyers would not drive out to a slopwoman's gate. If she mended the thing in silence, the name would outlive the truth by years, and a name like that, in a county the size of hers, would weigh far more against her than the March note ever could. So she chose the costly thing instead. She walked into Dwyer's on a Saturday when the store was full of men warming themselves at the stove. She stood in the middle of the plank floor where they all could see her, and she said it plainly and out loud. "I fed it wrong," Nell said. "I gave them the whey as the whole ration and cut the corn out from under it, and it scoured my hogs, and the fault was mine and no one else's in this room." The store went quiet as a store does when a person hands over the exact thing everyone came hoping to see. Purdy started to grin at the stove. She was not finished with him yet. "My father fed skim milk with ground corn beside it and his hogs grated top," she said. "I have his book at home to prove it. Come December, you will taste the difference. Then we will see who is the fool." Then she bought her sack of mineral and walked back out into the cold. She let the whole room make of it whatever it wished. She had handed those men the laugh they had come for, and she had bought with it the one old answer that fixed everything. It did not feel like winning. It felt like paying good cash for a thing she ought to have had for nothing. She rebuilt the ration off her father's page. She brought the corn back up to where it belonged. She ground it fine so the hogs could not sort the good from the poor and leave half in the trough. She set the whey against it now as the wash, and not the meal. She hung a mineral lick in the lot, because milk runs short on iron, and a hog kept on it will go pale and slow and never quite bloom without one. She fed the whey warm from the line and the ground corn dry alongside it. She watched the pens closely, morning and night, as a doctor watches a fever break. Within a week the scour dried up. The hogs came back onto their feed with an appetite. For the first time since summer began, they started to grow as a hog is truly meant to grow, steady and deep and quiet in the flesh. But the whey would not hold still, and July would not cooperate at all. Sweet whey run fresh off the line turned sour inside a single day in that heat, and the sour whey hit the hogs harder than she had planned for. One week in the middle of the month, she lost 3 whole loads before she could get them fed. 3 days' share of that 9,000-gallon week. Run off into a waste pit at the low end of the lot. It had turned into something she was frightened to pour down a good hog. Purdy heard of it inside a day and laughed about it for a week. He told anyone who would stand still that the slop was spoiling now faster than the woman could carry it, from the outside to a man who wanted it to. It looked like the front edge of the ruin she had been promised. She sat with it one long evening. She kept turning over the word she had been using, which was spoiled. And slowly she came to think it was the wrong word for what she was seeing. Whey does not rot when it sours. It acidifies. The same bacteria that turned sweet milk into clabber and cream into cheese will turn whey acid. And an acid whey is not a spoiled whey at all. It is a preserved one. The sourness she had been fighting so hard and pouring off into the pit in a panic was the very thing that would have kept the whey safe to feed, not for hours, but for days on end. If only she had stopped treating it as an accident to fear and started treating it as a step in the work to time. So she quit fighting the sour altogether. She let the whey ferment on purpose now, on a schedule. She fed it out on a steady 2-day turn, so that every trough of it had gone acid to the same reliable point before it reached a hog. The animals took the soured feed better than they had ever taken the sweet. Their guts had learned it and come to expect it. The losses ended for good. The thing that had looked in July like the beginning of the end became, by the middle of August, the most dependable feed on the whole place. All because she had stopped calling it spoilage and started calling it fermentation. Through the fall, the hogs came on in earnest. Anyone could see it who cared to walk out and look, and a few of the neighbors did look now. Quietly, along the fence line, without saying so at the store. The animals were long and deep and easy in their skins. They carried a bloom that bought feed alone almost never gives. But the thing that mattered most could not be seen from any fence line. It would not show itself until the killing floor. And that was the piece of the waiting that ground her down hardest through the short days. Fat is not laid down in the last month of a hog's life. It is laid down across the whole finishing period, a little every single day. Its character is decided by everything the animal has eaten, from weaning right through to the knife, whether it comes out firm and white or soft and yellow. A hog crammed on soft, rich feed in only its last few weeks lays down soft, oily fat. That fat renders out yellow and greasy, and it will not keep a season in the crock. A hog built up slow on a steady, balanced ration lays down hard white fat. That fat renders clean and firm, and it holds a full year without turning. Nell's hogs had been built on soured whey and ground corn since the middle of summer. If her father's page told the truth, they were laying down white fat every day they drew breath. And there was no way under heaven to prove it to a soul until she opened one up on a table. The butcher would not take her word for any part of it. His name was Emmett Roan. He kept a shop in town and a name of 30 years to protect. He told her flat, across his own counter, that he would not book a slop-fed hog on the strength of a promise. "I book what I can see cut," Roan said. "That rule has kept me honest 30 years. Bring me one hog. I'll open it, look at the fat with my own knife, and then we'll talk a price. Not before." It was fair, and it was hard, because it meant she could sell nothing at all until December. The note came due in March. Every week between was another week she hauled a free liability down the hill and still could not turn a cent of it into $1. But there was no arguing the man, and she did not try. She fed the 2-day turn, she filled the mineral lick, she ground the corn. And she watched the calendar the slow way you watch a pot that has made up its mind not to boil. In the first days of December, she loaded one barrow, the best hog she had raised, and hauled him into town. She stood in the cold of Roan's shop while the butcher did his work. She was not going to hear this verdict second-hand from any man alive. Roan opened the hog, and then he went very still. The fat cap along the back stood a full hand deep, and it was white, not cream. Not the dull yellow of a corn-crammed hog, a clean, hard white the whole way through. It was the kind of fat Roan had heard the old men describe from before his own time, and had scarcely ever handled himself. He pressed his thumb into it, and it held its shape and sprang back. He drew his knife slow across it, and it parted clean and did not smear or weep. For a long moment he said nothing at all. Then he said the only thing there was in him to say. "I have not seen fat like this since I was a boy," Roan said. "My father would have known it on sight. I only ever read of it." He rendered a kettle of it that same afternoon, as he would for any customer who asked. It came up out of the pot the color of new snow and set up in the pan as firm as good tallow. He weighed it out. It came to 14 pounds off the one hog, better than half again what he could pull from an ordinary carcass of the same size. He wiped his hands slowly on his apron and looked at her a good while before he spoke again. "Where did this come from?" Roan said. It was not truly a question, but she answered it as though it were. "The Creamery's Whey," Nell said. "The Whey Calhoun pays a fine to keep out of the creek, fed with ground corn, soured on a 2-day turn since June, the same slop the men at Dwyer's named me for." Roan looked down at the white lard setting up firm in his pan and then back up at her. Something behind his face changed over and settled for good. "Then those men are fools," he said, "and I'll not be one with them. I'll book every hog you own, and take all the lard you can render besides, at 2 cents over the top of the county. Weight fat yields more and keeps longer, and every housewife knows it the moment it sets." Then he did one thing more, and it came to matter as much as the price. He weighed her lard out a second time, where the whole counter could see him do it. He read the figure aloud to the shop, and he took up his ink and wrote it on the tag with his own hand. 14 pounds, white, off a single slop-fed hog. The men who had named her at Dwyer's heard that number by supper time, carried shop to shop the easy way a good figure travels. The first Saturday she sold lard, she carried a single-stone crock into town. She sold clean out of it before noon. She drove the empty crock home with $11 folded in her coat and an order book with real names in it. It was not much money against the note, but it was the first money that wet ground had ever made her, instead of costing her in longer than she cared to count. The next Saturday, the crock emptied twice over, and she carried home $34. Roan had already booked 3 more of her hogs at the grade he had promised. The women who had bought a crock the week before came back now for 2. The lard had fried clean and had not so much as breathed of turning. They told their sisters and their neighbors, and the neighbors harnessed up and drove out to see for themselves. One of them was an older woman in a black coat. She turned a fresh crock in her hands at the tailgate as if it were fine china and asked Nell outright what on earth she fed to get lard so white clear through. "Milk the Creamery pays to be rid of," Nell told her, "and my father's corn ration out of an old book. That is the whole secret, and you're welcome to it." By the first full week of December, the lard money had reached $96. The lane out to the Braddock place had wagons standing along it on a Saturday, on a road that had never carried much of anything but the mailman before. The word had gone all around the county as good words travel. Slower than a laugh, but a great deal heavier in the hand, and far harder to take back. The slop woman's lard would not turn. It fried clean, and it kept white clear through to spring. It was, they were saying now, in the very stores that had named her, the finest lard anyone in the county could call to mind. And it was coming off the same way Calhoun was paying fines to keep out of the creek. The Saturday after that, she took $180. There was a line standing at her gate for the first time in her life. Women mostly, with crocks and coins in their gloved hands, waiting in the cold between the leaky tank on its cart and the trough where the hogs still fed on their white-running river. Not one soul in that line was laughing. And on the 3rd Saturday before Christmas, the ledger crossed the line she had been walking toward since June. The lard and the grated pork together had brought $460 into the house. The March note, $412, was covered now and covered over besides. Paid out of milk, the Creamery had spent good money to run into a creek. That was the morning the thing she had built stopped being a gamble and became a plain settled fact. And it arrived, as such mornings always do, on an ordinary cold day, with her hands full of a crock and a line of her neighbors waiting quiet on her at the gate. She did not celebrate it. That was not her way, and there was still Whey to feed and a line to serve. She counted the money at the kitchen table that night, twice, the way her father had taught her to count anything that mattered. Only then did she write the sum in the book. What she felt was not triumph. It was something steadier and older than that. The plain relief of a person who has carried a great weight up a long grade, set it down at last, and found her back unbroken. The 40 acres were hers to keep. The hogs were fat and white to the bone. And the creek that had shamed the creamery all summer was 2 miles down its own quiet fall, making her a living. There was one figure left, and it was the one that truly finished the story, though it was the smallest number of them all. The creamery's butter sold that winter for 30 cents a pound. Nell's lard, rendered from the creamery's own thrown-away waste, went out her gate at 40. The waste had beaten the product clean. The thing Calhoun paid to be rid of had outsold the thing he made his whole living upon, and it did it in his own market, to his own customers, 2 miles straight down his own hill. For that was the turn she had never planned and could not have. The people standing in her lane with their crocks were, a great many of them, the creamery's own trade. They bought Calhoun's butter in town on a Tuesday. Then they drove the 2 miles downhill to buy Nell Braddock's lard on a Saturday. The downhill run that had made her Whey come free was the very same downhill run that now carried the creamery's own customers to her gate. It galled a few of the men, at the start of it, to buy from the slop woman. Some of them sent their wives, so they would not have to stand in the line themselves. But lard is lard. A rancid crock is a real grief in a cold house, and pride is a poor grease to fry a winter's eggs in. By January they came out themselves. They stood in the cold beside the leaky tank and talked hogs with her, as if they had never called her a single hard name. She did not remind them of it. There was no profit in the reminding and no kindness. She had learned that winter that the surest answer to a laugh is not another laugh. It is a crock of white lard that keeps clean through to spring. Emmett Roan did well by her, and well by himself in the doing of it. He had the only white lard in the county on his shelves. Men drove in from 2 townships over to carry it home, and he never once let a customer forget where the stuff came from. He told the whole story over his counter, the way, the ledger, the 2-day turn, as a man tells a thing he is proud to have had a hand in. It was Roan, more than any other soul, who turned the slop woman back into Nell Braddock in the county's mouth. And he did it the only way that ever lasts, with a scale, a knife, and a plain figure set down in ink where no man could stand and argue with it. Calhoun drove out himself, once near the end of it. He stood a while at the edge of the waiting line and watched the women file past the trough with their coins. He watched his own waste run right down a homemade pipe into a lot full of the finest hogs in the valley. Whatever he had driven the 2 miles down to say, he did not say it. He looked a long time at the leaky tank riding on its low homemade cart. He looked at the line of pipe climbing the slope back toward his own gate. Then he took off his hat and put it slowly back on his head. "You ought to have told me it would work," Calhoun said out the truck window. It was as near to a decent word as the man had anywhere in him. "I did tell you," Nell said. "You laughed at me, and you signed the paper anyway. and I thank you kindly for the second part of it." He did not laugh at that. He drove back up the hill as he had come, and the Whey kept running down it after him. By the first week of March, the note was paid in full, and there was money laid by in the tin besides, set aside for spring corn and for a better tank that would actually hold what she poured in it. The wet 60 that had never once been able to decide what it was for had finally, that winter, made up its mind. It meant to be downhill of a creamery. That was the one thing about the whole poor place that had never looked like an advantage to a living soul. Not until a woman with a leaking tank and her dead father's ledger walked out and looked at it twice. In the spring, she bought the better tank, a sound one that held every drop she put in it. She kept the leaky one anyway, up on its homemade cart at the head of the lot. Because a person ought to keep the thing that taught her. She bought her seed corn with cash that year, the first time in longer than she could remember. She paid the creamery's own hired man to help her mend the pipe where the frost had heaved it, and Calhoun let the man come. The hogs farrowed in a long, warm rush that spring. She kept back the best of the gilts to build her herd, and she fed them as the old book said to. Milk and ground corn together, 2 halves made into one whole ration. The wet 60 had a purpose now, and so did she. She kept the old book on the kitchen shelf where it had always sat. She wrote in it now as her father had written in it. Feed and weather and prices, and the weight of every hog that left the place, in a hand that had grown smaller and stuttier across the length of that year. And underneath the entries for that winter, she set down one line that was not arithmetic at all. She thought whoever kept the book after her had a right to know it. "The thing nobody wants is only worthless," she wrote, "until somebody standing downhill of it learns how to feed it." That was the part the county remembered longest in the end. Not that a woman had made a good living off milk waste, though she had, and enough of it to keep her ground and her good name both. What they remembered and told over was simpler. The waste had been running past every one of them for 100 years. In a creek anybody in the valley could walk down to and see. And it had taken a person with nothing left in the world to lose to go down the hill and simply pick it up. There were men that winter who tried to do as she had done once the Lard money was too plain to miss. A few of them knocked on Calhoun's door for Whey of their own, but Whey carried uphill to a lot is only water a man has paid a hauler to lift. Whey fed as a meal instead of a wash will scour a herd exactly as it scoured hers, and Whey poured out sweet in the July heat will turn before it ever reaches a trough. The waste was free to every one of them. The knowing what to do with it was not free at all. That was the part Nell had earned, in the frost and the ledger and the long, shamed summer. And it was the one piece of the whole business that could not be knocked loose from a creamery door for the asking. Her father had known it in his own quiet way. He had never once said it plainly, and he had let the knowing die with the Danby cheese house. A man gets busy with the living of his life and forgets to write down the things he believes any fool can see. Nell wrote it down. That was the difference between the two of them in the finish. And it was very nearly the whole of what she meant to leave. Not the money, which spent like any other money and was gone. Not the lard, which was eaten up by spring. What she left was a line in a book. It told the next person exactly where to stand and what to carry, and how not to be ashamed of gathering up the thing a laughing man throws away. There is a kind of wealth that lies in plain and open sight. It is priced at nothing, because moving it costs more than it appears to be worth. It waits on the one person who happens to be standing in the right low place, with the right old book open on the table. Nell Braddock happened to be standing there. The question her story leaves behind is a quieter one, and it is worth sitting with of a winter evening, close by the fire. The creek was there for every soul in the county. The Whey was free to anyone at all who cared to ask. So if it had been your gate at the bottom of that long hill, would you have poured the slop back into the water the way it had always been poured? Or would you have walked up the hill, hat in your hand, and asked a laughing man for every worthless gallon he had?